Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me um, over this presentation on positive reinforcement and punishment. This is an applied behavior analysis guide for educators. Just a little bit about myself. I have been teaching for 16 years. I teach special education. I am certified in moderate to severe intellectual disability, early childhood education. I got my master's in 2017 from William Woods in secondary administration and special education director. My current position is teaching sixth through eighth self-contained classroom. Most of my students have a primary diagnosis of autism and moderate to severe behaviors. So that's just a little bit about me. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Amber Nicholas, and I have been teaching for 13 years within special education. I currently teach sixth grade writing, mild to moderate. I love my job. I love the classroom environment, and every day presents a different opportunity to learn and grow.
So, Amber, have you ever heard of applied behavior analysis?
I have heard of it very early on from teaching, just kind of never really dived wholeheartedly into it. But of course, I apply it every day within my classroom settings.
What comes to mind when you think of behavior modification?
Well, focusing on that word modification, basically what you're doing is you're analyzing the behavior that's being shown within your classroom environment and changing it. Going from that negative behavior response and forming it into a positive behavior so each student can function in the classroom and outside the classroom.
You sound super knowledgeable on this already. Can you think of any examples of how you've used reinforcement or punishment in your classroom setting?
So within my classroom setting, the positive reinforcement, a lot of it is that verbal praise for the behavior that you want to see that's happening for the individual student. Um, Also, just finding out a token economy system that can help the student, what drives them to want to perform the preferred behavior. Punishment in the classroom, of course, can be anything from taking away desired items from that student or basically delaying what that student wants, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I really appreciate how you brought up the motivators because I think individualizing what the students are working for, knowing what motivates them is so important. What a great contribution. Here's a little background to ABA. So we use it to understand and improve behavior. It focuses on socially significant behavior. So communication, social skills, daily living, some of the adaptive skills we work on. It has immediate and long lasting effects that improve the quality of life for the individual that we're working with, but also their significant others, whether that be their family, their teachers, friends. We want to improve that quality of life for them overall. We want to develop interventions and teach replacement behaviors. We want to make sure we're teaching them what we want them to do, not just what we don't want them to do. Of course, we need to analyze if these interventions are effective, and interventions should produce improvements. So if you're not seeing improvements, then ABA would say we need to stop and switch things up. So positive reinforcement is the most important and widely used principle in applied behavior analysis. When a specific behavior is reinforced, it tends to occur more frequently in the future. So by providing that positive praise you're talking about, whether it be when a student turns in their homework on time or remembers to raise their hand and you notice, that can make such a significant difference in what they do. Okay, so also you probably know what a behavior is, but we're going to go over it just a little bit. Human behavior is everything people do, including how they move, say, think, and feel. In ABA, we don't focus so much on those internal feelings and thoughts, but more on the behaviors that are observable and measurable. So by observable, we can see it, we can hear it, we can detect it in some way. And measurable, we can count the frequency and or the duration. One thing that I've learned in class so far is the dead man's test. And that basically says if a dead man can do it, then it's not a behavior. So getting rained on wouldn't be a behavior. So that's just kind of, if you're ever unsure, is this a behavior? You can put it to the dead man's test. So first we're going to go over positive reinforcement versus bribery. Positive reinforcement happens after the behavior has occurred and increases the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future. Positive reinforcement focuses on building positive behavior by pairing it with positive outcomes. Again, we mentioned long-term effects across all environments. It encourages positive behavior by building intrinsic motivation. So when that student feels good because they've received that praise, that good feeling that the child has inside is going to motivate them intrinsically to repeat that behavior in the future. Also, with positive reinforcement, the adult is more in control. When we look at bribery, we will see how that can become something where the child is more in control. So with bribery, the reward often comes first in hopes that a desired behavior will come, or in an effort to stop a negative behavior. So if you think about being in a restaurant with your child and they start throwing the fit and you do like, well, if you sit quietly, I'll give you the iPad. And then that makes the child's behavior kind of contingent on having the iPad. Or if you are good in the restaurant, or here's the iPad, you can have it if you're good in the restaurant. That's kind of a bribery situation. So bribery is used to manipulate and influence a behavior before it occurs, or in desperation to stop a negative behavior. It leads to dependence on external rewards. It only works in the moment. It often reinforces negative behavior in the student and also the teachers. So we as adults, when we see, well, Sammy's throwing a fit and screaming at the top of his lungs, but once I gave him the iPad, he calmed down. We're also learning that that's a method to calm Sammy down, and that's not teaching him any kind of replacement behavior. It's just not going to have a long-term effect. So, and it's also teaching Sammy, hey, if I throw this fit, Miss Nicholas is going to give me the iPad. So it might achieve compliance or stop a behavior in the moment, but it lacks long-term effects, doesn't teach those replacement behaviors, and then the child is in control. Okay, So the power of positive reinforcement, this graph right here is something that is super interesting. It's in our main text for the applied behavior analysis, the ABA book that is used by BCBAs. And this chart just shows Robbie was a disruptive third grader. And this was the percentage of times that he was off task, interrupting, not paying attention, being disruptive without any adult attention. Once his teacher started having more proximity to him, praising him for being on task, you can see how much his behavior increased just by attention. We weren't doing tokens, we weren't giving out candy, nothing like that, but just teacher attention. Then she took that attention away and his behavior dropped again. Then they tried the reinforcement again and back up it went. And when she kept that reinforcement, Robbie was able to maintain that behavior. So I just think that's really important for us as educators to know how incredibly valuable just being present can be for our students. Over here, we have kind of a cycle. So for positive reinforcement, so our positive behavior happens. We reinforce that behavior. Good job, Sammy. Way to raise your hand. And then the student is more likely to do the positive behavior again. And then we're back up to positive behavior happens. So very simple cycle that works really well. So here's just a few examples. So the teacher assigns work, the student completes the assignment, they receive a sticker, the student's assignment completion increases. So we know that that reinforcement is working. Another example, the teacher assigns work, the student completes the assignment, the student receives a sticker, but then we see that the student's assignment completion is inconsistent. It goes up and down. So if there's inconsistency in the responses, what the student is doing, that the reinforcer isn't working and we might need to try something else. Okay, so Amber, I'm going to come back to you. I know you mentioned a token economy and a few other things. Do you currently use positive reinforcement in your classroom? And if you do you use it more on an individual level? Do you use it as a group level? How does that work on your end?
I use it kind of both, but speaking more to the individual level, just going off a current student that I had, this student, very staff intensive, and kind of going back to what you said, if the reinforcer isn't working, you're having inconsistent data, you need to go back and change that. And that's what I was constantly doing. We were always, collaborating to see what was working and what was not working. And the student also had, implemented, timed reinforcers throughout the day, that if they met a certain percentage, they would earn this, reward that they liked. And they also had ones that were contingent on how many points they were getting within an hour. So always analyzing that data to see what we need to change to gain that consistency. It worked. You got to know your students. You got to know, where they're at. Also, just a lot of it that I also use as a whole group is breaking down those tasks for the students. Kind of just seeing that there's small teachable moments to teach that behavior that you want in your classroom. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I use in there. And then just as you're seeing that consistency, you can start to kind of fade away as well. That's, could be long-term, but as you see that consistency and it's working, you can kind of take away and give them that independence. And once they've learned those behavior skills.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the ultimate goal, is for them to be able to use these behaviors long term and in all environments.
Another thing to add, a lot of things that I use is those visual supports.
Mhm.
And those can be verbal or just nonverbal, like pointing to the expected behavior, just to remind the student. I use that a lot too, whole group and individual.
Yeah, I think visual reinforcements are crucial. So I know within your school, you work on a team, you work with other teachers. Do you know if your team, if other teachers on your team use positive reinforcement, or if that's something that's widely used at your grade level?
I feel like it is within my sixth grade team. I feel like we're using the same kind of language and reinforcers, kind of just so when we're working with the same students, that student has that same language and they know, we know what works best for each student. So I kind of see it a lot. A lot of it is that verbal praise and just this is the expected behavior that is within this classroom setting.
Awesome. Okay, so the next thing that we're, talking about here is okay, this is telling me my meeting's going to end in 10 minutes. Is what is punishment? Punishment is a consequence that follows a behavior. So with punishment, we have both positive punishment, which adds an undesired stimulus to decrease the likelihood of a behavior repeating. So let's say Sammy keeps talking out during a classroom discussion, you give him extra homework. That would be a positive punishment. You're adding something extra homework that Sammy's probably not going to like. Negative punishment removes a stimulus after a behavior, but has that same goal to decrease the likelihood of it being repeated in the future. So Sammy talks out, he loses recess. The loss of recess would hopefully, possibly decrease the likelihood of the talking out being repeated in the future. Here are a couple examples, kind of what I just said, except for Sammy turns his math into an airplane. He gets 10 extra problems. He doesn't throw the airplane anymore. He doesn't want that math homework. An example of negative, Tommy shouts at his teacher. Sammy loses recess. Sammy doesn't shout at his teacher again. Sometimes here's an example of when it doesn't work. Sammy laughs when a classmate gets the wrong answer. Sammy is scolded by his teacher, but Sammy continues to laugh when his classmate gets an answer wrong. So, sometimes you and I both know that students can thrive off of attention, whether it be negative attention or positive attention. So in this scenario, scolding Sammy is not doing any good. There are some ethical considerations in ABA. We want to prioritize less intrusive interventions. So we want to always use reinforcement before punishment. So, for example, Sammy does really well participating in a class discussion, remembering to raise his hand. He doesn't shout out. We notice this and praise him. Those are examples of, again, we're telling him what we want him to do. We're noticing when he does it. We're reinforcing that. And it should be our first line of defense. We want to try to positively reinforce behavior before we resort to punishment. Punishment can damage the relationship between individuals and teachers. It can cause resentments. It's just, if we can keep the positivity going, that should be our first try. So here's just a little bit of a table. We've got positive reinforcement and punishment. So positive reinforcement is used to increase the frequency of a behavior or maintain it. Again, we know happens after the desired behavior. It adds a stimulus, often something pleasant like that praise or a token, helps build positive relationship. Again, that long-term effect in all environments. And we're teaching replacement behaviors. Students know what we want them to do. Punishment, it's used to decrease undesired behavior. It happens after a undesired behavior has happened. The positive punishment adds something. We went over that. Negative punishment removes something. All of that is done to discourage the repetition of a behavior. And we kind of just went over this, but it can cause resentment, fear, avoidance, possible harm to relationship. It doesn't always teach them what we want them to do. Like when we're punishing students, we're not talking about what to do instead all the time. And it's not always effective long-term or in all environments. So I'm going to go over this one and we're going to kind of do a I do, we do, you do on the scenarios and identifying what's being used. So Sammy often struggles to stay on task during independent work time. If he is able to stay on task for 10 minutes, he earns a sticker. Once he has 3 stickers, he earns 15 minutes of iPad time. Positive reinforcement or punishment. So
Sorry.
that's okay. This is positive reinforcement. Yeah. He received his stickers. He's getting that iPad time. The iPad is motivating for Sammy. He wants to do his work. He wants to earn his stickers and get that iPad. Now it's your turn. I'll read it to you. Sammy and his class are taking a test. Sammy tears a corner off, wads it up, and throws it at the student in front of him. His teacher sees this and scolds him in front of the class and takes away his recess. Positive reinforcement or punishment?
Punishment.
Yes. And I kind of tricked you on that one because really Sammy's getting 2 things in that scenario. The scolding, he's receiving that, and then he's also losing recess. So that's kind of a double whammy. Okay, here's another one. Sammy sees a classmate fall down at recess. He immediately goes to help them up and calls for the teacher. Sammy is praised for being such a good friend and receives a brag tag to take home to his mom.
Positive reinforcement.
Yes. Good job. Good job. Okay, so here's just a few reminders. We want to use positive reinforcement first, teach our students what to do instead of what not to do. We can use positive reinforcement as a group or as an individual. You want to give the reinforcement immediately or as soon as possible, because otherwise you can end up reinforcing the wrong behavior. Keep an eye out for opportunities to catch them being good, collect data, make sure everything is effective. Keep it simple. It doesn't need to be super complicated or time consuming. Be consistent, use punishment as a last resort, be mindful and fair when doing so. I think one other thing I would add to this too is what you said, and it does kind of say making sure the reinforcements are effective, but making sure whatever we're using is motivating for the students. That's so important. This is my resource, the Cooper Applied Behavior Analysis book, and that is all that I have for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me.